Tonight, the war of words developing between the U.S. and Israel. Secretary of State John Kerry says Israel is pursuing policies that threaten the peace process. Then Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu blasts Kerry and President Obama. We get analysis from Michael O'Hanlon of the Brookings Institution. Then Trump's transition tantrums. He blasts President Obama for making his transition more complicated, as Trump blasts the tradition of America having just one president at a time. Our panel will respond. And headaches for both Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio. Cuomo facing the crumbling of his signature upstate development programs, while de Blasio tries to change his PR problems and fails spectacularly. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman, in tonight for Richard French. It is not unusual for the United States, its president or its top diplomats to make speeches and issue warnings to the heads of other nations. Nor is it unusual for the leaders of other nations to do the same towards the United States. What is unusual, however, is when that other nation is one of America's closest allies, Israel. Yet that is exactly what's been happening in recent days, beginning with the UN Security Council vote condemning Israeli settlements in disputed territories on Friday. And today the tension was amplified thanks to dueling speeches from Secretary of State John Kerry and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
The fight against expanding Israeli settlements.
No American administration has done more for Israel's security than Barack Obama.
Secretary of State John Kerry defended the Obama administration's move to allow the approval of a United Nations resolution calling Israeli settlements in the disputed West Bank illegal. Kerry says the settlements, nearly 100,000 built since 2009, jeopardized the two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. But he also condemned Palestinian violence and terrorism.
If Israel goes down the one-state path, it will never have true peace with the rest of the Arab world. And I can say that with certainty.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called Kerry's speech skewed and obsessively focused on settlements.
Israelis do not need to be lectured about the importance of peace by foreign leaders. Israel's hand has been extended in peace to its neighbors from day one.
Netanyahu promised to provide proof to the next president that the U.S. orchestrated the UN vote. President-elect Donald Trump on Twitter, "We cannot continue to let Israel be treated with such total disdain and disrespect. Stay strong, Israel. January 20th is fast approaching."
The incoming administration has signaled that they may take a different path. That is for them to decide.
Kerry pointed out the Obama administration was following a U.S. policy on Israel that's been in place for decades and supported by the international community. Kenneth Moten, ABC News, Washington.
There is a lot to unpack in all of this, and for perspective, analysis, and context, we turn to Michael O'Hanlon. Michael is the Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy at the nonpartisan Brookings Institution. So, Michael, the dueling speeches we saw on the international front today, John Kerry saying that Israeli settlements equal the end of the two-state solution, which is the only way for peace in the Middle East, according to him. Prime Minister Netanyahu slamming Obama and Kerry in a pretty remarkable response. Your takeaways from today?
Well, I thought Secretary Kerry's speech was almost a farewell speech on an issue that has obviously bedeviled him and many other Americans for a long time, about which he's extremely passionate and very knowledgeable. It went on way too long for an American TV audience, but maybe his point was more to sort of show his mastery, to get a lot of things off his chest, to ultimately give those 6 principles for future negotiations, and you know, to really sort of make a marker there, the same way Bill Clinton had 16 years ago, even after an effort had failed back then. Prime Minister Netanyahu, you know, I'm less a fan of what he said in his remarks in terms of their content. But no matter whether you like Netanyahu or not, you have to recognize he's an extremely astute student of American politics. And he does very well with people on both sides of the aisle. And he knows that Donald Trump's going to be our president in 3 weeks. And in a sense, he doesn't mind, he senses perhaps instinctively that driving a wedge between Obama and Trump on this issue is actually not going to hurt him, not going to hurt Netanyahu, not going to hurt the Netanyahu government, and in the short term at least, not going to hurt Israel. I think in the broader sense, Kerry's right, Netanyahu's government is wrong. We need to hasten our work towards a two-state solution, and that's the only viable long-term hope for Israel's safety and stability as a Jewish state. But in the short term, Netanyahu is aware that he's not going to have to deal with Obama and Kerry any longer. And if he can make their approach seem somewhat unfair to him or unfair to the Jewish people, then that sets him up nicely with Trump. So that's part of how I would interpret his speech.
Give us some historical perspective on what we've seen in the last few days. How unusual is it for the U.S. to allow the Security Council vote we saw on Friday, as well as for the Israeli Prime Minister to really combat the U.S. president like we're seeing right now?
The former is a lot more common than the latter. So as Secretary Kerry himself went through in his speech, there were a number of times in the Bush, Clinton, previous Bush, Reagan administrations when the United States supported or at least abstained from vetoing UN Security Council resolutions that called for restraint by both sides to this challenging situation, the Israelis and the Palestinians, and called for actions that would serve the interest of a two-state solution. And as you know, the Oslo process in the early 90s, which Kerry also referred to in his speech, set up this whole notion. It codified the idea that we're going to go for a two-state solution. And President George W. Bush, who had some more hardliners in his administration, nonetheless, he also supported that concept. And that meant that things like settlements in the middle of the West Bank were not going to be consistent with the strategy of trying to get a viable, coherent and cohesive Palestinian state someday. And therefore, UN Security Council resolutions would admonish or encourage Israel to avoid such settlements. At the same time, they would admonish the Palestinians and others about using terrorism against the Jewish state. So there's a long history of those kind of resolutions. And I think Secretary Kerry, in some sense, was on solid ground in reminding Netanyahu, as well as U.S. critics, of that fact. It still begs the question why you would bother to have this sort of a thing get through in late December when you're about to leave the White House. And it does, to me, feel like there's a little bit of frustration being voiced by the Obama administration. I believe that Senator Mitchell, obviously a Democrat, a longstanding, fair-minded proponent of a two-state solution, I'm not sure even he was a big fan of allowing that resolution to go through. And I think it does set up Netanyahu for this opportunity to essentially trash an incumbent president. In the hope and in the expectation that he'll do better with the successor. So getting to the second part of your question very briefly, what Netanyahu did today and what he's been doing these last few days is rather unusual. The idea of an Israeli government being so openly critical of its one really important, powerful friend in the world. But again, Netanyahu knows where we are in the political calendar, and my guess is he'll sort of get away with this, at least in the short-term tactical political sense, and it won't bother Trump, and it won't bother the GOP leadership in Congress, and in the end, it will allow Netanyahu perhaps to strengthen his domestic coalition at home, which is the very coalition that's against negotiating seriously with the Palestinians. So I'm not sure that Kerry and Obama have really done the cause they believe in any great service with what they've done this week.
You touched on some of the domestic politics that are involved in what a lot of people look at as a foreign policy issue, but this is a political issue both in the United States and in Israel, particularly with the groups that have been blasting the Security Council vote. But do we know, are the loudest voices on this representative of the masses or the majorities in both the United States and Israel?
Well, I think that the notion of a two-state solution is still pretty well supported in both countries. But there are elements of Netanyahu's own government, as you know, that are minority parties in terms of their overall, vote within Israel itself. But they are an integral part of Netanyahu's coalition, which allowed him to become prime minister, because Israel has a lot more than two parties. So Netanyahu can almost partly camouflage his own views, which I'm not really sure how to interpret at this stage, in the sense of trying to be deferential to the parties he needs to keep in his coalition to hold on to his job as prime minister. In other words, I can't tell if Netanyahu really favors a two-state solution or not. And he doesn't necessarily even need to fully clarify that to his own public. He can play a little bit of a double game. He can hint at times that he's still for it, provided that 1,000 other things happen beforehand in terms of improving Israeli security. So my sense is that Netanyahu is sort of a master of finessing this issue. And even though the Israeli population writ large, I think, still supports a two-stage solution, they like Netanyahu's toughness, and they're also a little bit less persuaded there will be a two-state solution than they used to believe. In the 1990s, there was enough momentum behind this idea that it seemed like it probably would happen, if not right away, then later. And then President Bush tried, and after 9/11, we had a whole different climate. And he tried, of course, with the famous Annapolis venture. I think that was 2007. That whole period from 93 to 07 or so, there was a real sense that maybe it was possible. But I think the expectation it will happen is diminishing in most countries, including Israel and the United States.
Well, we could easily talk about this for the full hour, but unfortunately we have to leave it there. Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow on Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. As always, Michael, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Up next, if thinking about U.S.-Israeli relations wasn't confrontational enough for you, how about Trump versus Obama? The president-elect blaming the president for his transition troubles, then takes credit for the strong Obama economy. All he does his best to eliminate the notion of one president at a time.